Hey everyone, so the other day we went over the way that civil liberties were limited specifically in the North. We talked about habeas corpus and how the habeas corpus had been suspended and the various cases that came up due to the suspension of habeas corpus in the North. So the South we didn't talk about, but we're going to talk about that today. So the South was different. They still had a lot of civil liberties issues, but one of the big problems when it comes to assessing the civil liberty issues in the South is that the Confederacy wasn't the best at record keeping, at least compared to the North. So we do have some records, and we do know some things and ways in which the civil liberties of the Southerners were restricted during the war, but the records are kind of bare when you compare them to what we have for the Union. But it's also important to one thing that would be a big difference is keeping in mind the South isn't vulnerable to their capital really being surrounded by enemies like the Union would be if Maryland had become a Confederate state. So you don't get the issues in Confederacy. You wouldn't have a Merriman in the Confederacy, so that wouldn't be a problem they would have. And additionally, Davis didn't have to worry about there being political opponents to the fight for Confederate independence. So in that sense, he didn't have the same problem that Lincoln had with someone like Vallandigham in Indiana and Ohio and Illinois, making statements questioning Lincoln's leadership and his changing of the focus of the war. So Davis and the Confederacy in general didn't have to worry about that. So there wouldn't be court cases like Vallandigham or Merriman with the South. But instead, what you have laws that were passed by the Confederacy that led to a lot of opposition, maybe not really vocal or really aggressive in a lot of sense opposition, but there was definitely some opposition from the records we have to a couple of these laws that were passed. And when it comes to these laws, one thing that is important to keep in mind is the differences in the way that the North and the South viewed the citizens of the other location. For instance, the North viewed Southerners as living in the United States. They were U.S. citizens, they were rebelling, but they were U.S. citizens. Whereas the Confederacy viewed themselves as an independent country, and Union, or people that lived in the Union, were foreigners. So that comes in a play whenever it comes to some of the laws they passed. So, some of the laws we're going to talk about today. My handy dandy little whiteboard. All right, first up, we have, don't want to rub them out, even though I think I just did. All right, the Alien Enemies Act of 1861. So what this law did essentially was they declared that if you were living in the South, that you needed to declare that you were a Confederate citizen. If you would not declare that you were a citizen of the Confederacy, you needed to leave, or you would get arrested. So here, if you're not a Confederate citizen, you don't belong in the South, and you'll get arrested. So that was one way where you could have civil liberties being limited in the South for Confederate citizens, because here, or Americans living there, because they're restricting here their political speech essentially, because so not every Southerner supported the breaking apart of the Union and didn't support independence. So these people that refused to support the Confederacy were basically told, leave or you're going to be arrested. That brings us up to the next one, also of 1861, and that's the Sequestration Act. Sequestration Act of 1861. So what this fun little law is going to do is basically if you're a Unionist, so somebody that was supporting the Union, your property could be seized. So if you were arrested or you left and you were a known Unionist, your property would be seized, and no, they didn't have to pay you for your property. Additionally, if a Unionist had left and a property that was to go to them, like something being willed to them, that was also to be taken and not provided to the Unionist. So that would be a case where you have property rights being limited in the Confederacy for simply not supporting the Confederacy and rather supporting the Union. Next up is the 1863 Impressment Act. So what happens with the Impressment Act, actually I don't think I showed that one to you enough. The Impressment Act The Impressment Act, what it did was essentially say that the Confederate armies had the right to seize any goods that they needed to fight the war. So if they needed food, if they needed animals to help them fight the war, like horses or ox or donkeys or anything like that, or if they wanted slaves or needed slaves, that they had the right to seize them because of the war. So of course, people are not going to take very kindly to their property being taken for the purpose of the war effort at this time, especially because the South definitely, or the Confederacy definitely had a very strong states over federal government way they were developed. So the Confederate Army, when the Impressment Act was an law and an activity placed upon each individual Confederate state by the Confederate government rather than by the states themselves. So there was a lot of resentment here and a lot of questions about whether the Confederacy actually had the right to do this. Another thing that the Confederacy did was actually restricted travel, which to a certain extent the Union actually did this too. They did require people traveling from the rebelling states into the Union to have some sort of passport, and vice versa, for explaining why, and like permission to go back and forth, or why they needed to go back and forth. So the Union required that, and so did the Confederacy. And it actually got to the point where the Confederacy required it to travel within the Confederacy, and it would be a local army officer that would be required to sign off on your passport. This really is aimed at limiting Unionist activities that might harm their rebellion, essentially. There's not a whole lot of evidence that any request for a passport was rejected. It seems like it was mostly an inconvenience to Confederates or Southerners that were trying to travel through the Confederacy, that their travel was restricted and they had to go through these loopholes or jump through hoops to basically get to travel at this time. So that would be another one. Next and last on here, because this is a pretty short one, is the Tax in Kind Act. Essentially, tax in kind. It allowed state officials to collect 10% of farm goods, like any kind of crop, or specifically food crops like corn or wheat, something that could help feed the Confederate Army. So the people that were put in charge of collecting these taxes were called tax in kind assessors. They were also better known as ticks. T-I-K, but ticks, blood sucking, suck the blood from whatever they latch onto. So this probably was intentionally meant to be a derogatory nickname, at least in my mind. That's what it would probably mean to be, comparing them to a tick. So basically these people would go with properties, and it was up to them to determine what their 10% allotment would be. And this led to quite a bit of outrage from some Southerners. In fact, it is linked directly to a couple bread riots. The biggest one being the Richmond bread riot, where it was so large that it looks like it's quite possible that it had been pre-planned and wasn't just a impromptu riot. And in fact, it was actually organized by a woman named Mary Jackson. She was a meat seller. A couple of the rioters were arrested, but this just goes to show you that coupled with other bread riots breaking out in response to the Tax in Kind Act, the Southerners weren't overwhelmingly pleased with their civil liberties being taken away, even though in this case it seems like the bread riots, were more in response to economic reasons rather than political reasons. And when it comes to civil liberties, those are political. So there is some dispute about how much of this uproar was actually political versus actually the economic impacts it was having on individual Southern families. So there you have it. There's a short, brief explanation of the ways in which liberties were restricted in the Confederacy during the Civil War. And that would be great for a comparison, because Ace loves comparisons, or also just trying to assess how far civil liberties were restricted. So when you combine this video with the video from the other day, question that pops up a lot is, to what extent were civil liberties limited in the Union during the Civil War? Well, our video from the other day is how you would answer that, all that great information in there. And now if you get one that says, to what extent were civil liberties limited in the Confederacy during the Civil War, here you go. Or you could have one that was just in general, to what extent were civil liberties limited in both the North and the South during the Civil War. So those are some questions to keep in mind in your head, because those are the kinds of questions ACE likes to ask about civil liberties. And looking back on the previous ACE tests, The civil liberties question has come up quite a bit. So definitely as you're studying, if this is the unit that you really want to put your effort into when it comes to the ACE test in May, then definitely pay attention to the civil liberties sections. If you have any questions, please leave them in Schoology or message me, and I'll be happy to answer them for you. Have a good day.